Haruki Murakami is the biggest name in Japanese literature, arguably in history. I guess that's partially because Japanese literature has never been more popular on a global scale, and also because his books are very accessible to a Western audience. And there are a few reasons for that, one of which being he writes in a fairly American style. Murakami is a huge Americophile. Is there a word for that? Anglophile? Francophile? Don't know. Murakami loves American literature. He cut his teeth as a translator of American literature into Japanese. He has worked at universities in the US. I forget which university it was. It was one of the good ones. And he is very palatable to Western audiences, and I guess that half explains why he is so popular in the West. Whatever the reason, whatever the multiple reasons are for his massive popularity, you can't escape it. Murakami is huge. And I am a huge Murakami fan. Now, I don't like referring to him just as Murakami, even though I do all the time, we all do, because there are two great Murakamis in the world of Japanese literature, Haruki Murakami and Ryu Murakami, which is a word that I find very, very hard to say properly. Ryu means dragon. I cannot get my tongue around it. I really should practice that. Ryu Murakami is a crime writer. He writes a lot of really, really gritty Yakuza, crime, underground kind of books. And Haruki Murakami is just a little bit more palatable. He writes magic realism, urban fantasy, surreal Kafka-esque literary fiction. But it's kind of light literary fiction. It's very accessible, as I've said. Now, the big question is, if you are not a Murakami fan, if you want to be a Murakami fan, if you've always enjoyed the idea of reading Haruki Murakami, where do you begin? And of course, that depends on what kind of a reader you are. Murakami is an endlessly fascinating guy with a fairly decently sized library of works. As I've said, he is Japan's most popular author. He's Japan's best-selling author. He's huge. And he isn't perfect. I am a massive Murakami fan. I have been for a long time. I've read most of his books. However, I am aware of the issues. If you are a Murakami fan, or if you are someone who doesn't like the idea of reading Murakami, or you've read him and you didn't like him, I totally understand. Murakami has some issues, especially when it comes to sexism. He is infamous for the fact that he writes really awkward sex scenes in his books. The way he writes women is a little bit cringe. We're not here to really talk about Murakami's problems, we're here to talk about what's great about him and why you should read him and what you should start with. So, let's dig in. If you haven't read Murakami before, where do you start? What I'm going to do is break this down into 5 books. 5 doors into the world of Murakami. Depending on the kind of reader that you are, you're going to pick a different door. I'm going to try and cover all the bases. So stick with me. I'll give you 5 books, 5 Murakami books that all offer a different introduction into his world because he's a fairly diverse author, in spite of the fact that you can play Murakami bingo with almost all of his books. First up, this is for the reader who wants to know about their author first. I recommend What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. This is Murakami's great work of non-fiction. It's a very, very slender book. You can read it in a day or two. I adored this book. I read it at a time when I'd already read 3 or 4 Murakami novels, so I was already invested. And I really think it's a great introduction to him if you want to know a little bit about him, his culture, where he grew up, what he loves, his personal backstory, and his general philosophy towards life, writing, working, everything. It's a pretty intense package for how short it is and for how easy it is to read. What I talk about when I talk about running, at first is basically a document of Murakami's life as a runner. He loves running, he loves jogging, he partakes in marathons all around the world. He is a lifelong advocate for the wonders and the healing properties of running, for physical health, mental, emotional health. Murakami loves to run. And from here, from this central concept, philosophy, it extrapolates into his youth, his first job where he managed a whiskey bar in Tokyo before he became a writer, how he became a writer, the spark that led him to becoming an author, why he writes about the things that he writes about, and how running is integral to his writing process and his ideas. The book is also kind of a biography. As I said, it talks about his youth, it talks about his forays into writing, how he spent his 20s. He became a writer, I think, in his early 30s. and how he spent his time in the States. I mentioned that he taught at a university in somewhere in the States, I can't remember where. Talks about that. Talks about his experiences there, his experiences as a translator, how he loves the works of F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Great Gatsby, I think, is his favourite novel. He translated it into Japanese, and how all of that happened. So there's a lot going on. He talks a lot about running and marathons, etc., but it's bigger than that. So if you really want to know about Murakami, his life, his philosophy, his writing, everything about him, it's a really fantastic place to start. I think I'm going to title this one, For the Reader Who Wants to be Eased into the Weirdness. Murakami is a little bit weird. Murakami is an eccentric writer. He writes a lot of surrealism. He leans into the Kafka-esque an awful lot in his writing, while also kind of forging his own path into strangeness and obtuseness, if that's a word. Norwegian Wood offers you a quieter window into that world. Norwegian Wood is also, I think, his best-selling and most successful novel. If you've heard of Murakami before but haven't ever read him, you've probably heard of Norwegian Wood. Norwegian Wood is named after the Beatles song, and it doesn't have anything to do with woods in Norway. It's a book that Murakami himself has mixed feelings about. He's gone on record talking about how he doesn't love it, I think. Did I make that up? I might have made that up. Who knows? Regardless, I think it's a really great book. It is, I think, the only Murakami novel outside of his first two novellas, which I'm not going to talk about here because I don't love them, although one of our writers, Ollie, wrote a brilliant article for Books and Bow about why you should actually read his first two novellas, but I won't get into that today. I'm not a fan. You can read them if you want. If you want to begin at the beginning. Actually, we'll get to that. Aside from his first two novellas, Norwegian Wood is a fairly straight, magicless, surrealism-less novel. It dances with commercial fiction and literary fiction. It's a book that deals with suicide and mental health. It deals with youth and self-discovery and growth and people being pretty shit to each other. It's a fascinating book. It's not perfect, but it's good. Norwegian Wood tells the story of a young man who has already encountered suicide once he gets to university age and he goes to Tokyo. His best friend committed suicide, and he remains in touch with the girlfriend of that best friend. I've read this novel twice, and I still think I get things wrong when I talk about it. But this girlfriend of his friend who committed suicide is now in a mental institution up in the mountains, and he goes to visit her, and they have a kind of friendship, pseudo-romantic relationship building. Meanwhile, our protagonist is also entering into another friendship slash pseudo-romantic relationship with a girl that he's met at university. Her name's Midori, and it's the only name I remember of the three. I don't know why. As I said, I've read this book twice. Anyway, it's a great book because it's quite short. Murakami's novels tend to be exceptionally long. In the original Japanese, I think most of them are even longer than what we get in English translation. And Norwegian Wood is about 300 pages, so it's a very standard industry length. There's no surrealism or strangeness. It's got some heavy themes. It's got a lot of sexual and romantic themes. And it's a book about kind of wanky people being broken and being broken together and being healthy for each other and unhealthy for each other. It's about youth and making mistakes and learning and growing and dealing with trauma and dealing with difficult things, all the while pushing forward and making some really horrible mistakes along the way. It's a book about being human and the nastier sides of being human when you're at an age where you do kind of make mistakes and you can be nasty, intentionally or not. I think it's a very human book. I think Norwegian Wood is a really good place to start if you just want a very human novel before you get to all the weirdness. I briefly mentioned before the fact that I don't really like Murakami's first two novellas, his first two published works, which are available in translation. One is called Hear the Wind Sing, and the other is called Pinball 1977, I think. They are two novellas that are intrinsically linked. They follow the same nameless protagonist and his friendship with a guy called the Rat. There is a third book in this trilogy. Actually, there's a fourth, but I haven't read the fourth one. The third one, it's part of the Rat trilogy, kind of, but also please don't really connect them. You don't need to. I didn't know it when I read it. This was Murakami's first novel, his first decently sized work, and it's called A Wild Sheep Chase. And it is my joint favourite Murakami novel. A Wild Sheep Chase, as I said, is technically the third in a trilogy, but it really isn't. So yeah, don't stress it. It follows the story of a protagonist who's like, I don't know, he's around late 20s or something, and he gets roped into this weird situation where he has to track down a Chinese sheep up in Hokkaido. He meets a shady person and then he's sent on this journey, And the book begins in Tokyo and ends in Hokkaido. I love Hokkaido. I haven't yet been there, and I'm so eager to go. It's like the Scotland of Japan, and it's all snowy and mountains, and I've written about it, and I've read about it, and I love the idea of Hokkaido, and I haven't actually been yet, so maybe this year, maybe next year, I don't know. Anyway, it's a great book in terms of atmosphere. It also is Murakami's first foray into the surreal, but it's still really, really light. Murakami, the older he gets, the more experienced he gets as a writer, the more strange he gets. And the more the Murakami bingo sheet starts to get filled in, especially when you get to Killing Commendatore, which is basically a greatest hits of all of his tropes. But he hadn't gotten there yet with A Wild Sheep Chase. This was where he began looking at surrealism, and it's got elements of strangeness in it. It's a weird setup, as I've just described. But what's really nice about it is that it nails atmosphere. It really makes you want to go to Hokkaido. It makes you want to journey up north through Japan, and you get invested in our protagonist's very strange pseudo-Kafkaesque situation. Again, this was where he was beginning to experiment with the influences of Kafka on his writing, but he still wasn't quite there. I think it's a fantastic place to start. Thinking about it now, I'm pretty sure this was my first Murakami novel. I read this, then Norwegian Wood, and then the next one I'm going to talk about. I'm going to call this recommendation For the Reader Who Wants the Complete Package. How's that? That works. For the reader who wants the complete package, I recommend The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is again one of Murakami's most successful, most famous, most lauded and appreciated and beloved novels. I adore it. It is my joint favourite book along with A Wild Sheep Chase. If I had to pick one, it would probably be this. I think because, as I've said, it's the complete Murakami package. I think The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, I would probably take my top spot. I also have really fond memories of reading it back when I lived in Bristol. So this is a fantastic place to start. If you don't mind the surrealism, if you don't mind the strangeness, if you don't mind the absurd quality of his writing where odd things happen and they do not get explained, it's great. I mean, he's not Kobo Abe. If you want to read really weird, surreal, strange Japanese fiction that makes your head spin but is still really good, you should read Kobo Abe. I've written an article on him. You can go read it, I'll link it below. But Murakami, he's not Kobo Abe strange. He's Murakami strange. And The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is that strangeness, not quite dialed up to 11, still accessible, still readable, relatable, understandable, and a lot of fun. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle follows the story of a man who is a little bit shit. He's unemployed when we begin the story. His cat has gone missing, and he's living in the Setagaya district neighborhood of Tokyo. I used to work at a university in Setagaya. It's a really nice area. I think it's also where Light Yagami of Death Note lives. It's basically a really nice suburban area that's pretty central within Tokyo. I like Setagaya. It's a really chill place. I'd love to live there. So this guy's living there, little suburban life, and his cat's gone missing, and then his wife's gone missing. This guy just keeps losing people. And when his wife goes missing, he doesn't really know what to do. He's just like, okay, wife's gone, where's she gone? Now his wife, apologies, I can't remember any character names. His wife has a brother, and this brother is a bit of a dick, and our protagonist and his brother-in-law do not get on at all. Our protagonist is a bit of a wet blanket. He does not take charge of his life. You can tell that his wife is very much the powerful one of the couple, and so our protagonist kind of has to pull up his bootstraps, pull up his socks, and deal with his problems. His cat's gone, his wife's gone, his brother-in-law's a dickhead, and now he's got this phone call that keeps coming in. This strange woman keeps calling him, and he doesn't know who she is. And I cannot remember exactly, but there's some connection between her and the island of Malta. I can't remember. Malta comes into it. Her name is Malta, or she wants to move to Malta, or both. I can't remember. And she has a sister. The sister comes into it later. It's all very strange. Our protagonist also has a next-door neighbor who's a teenage girl who is absolutely fascinated with his weird situation, and she kind of accompanies him on his journey trying to find his wife. And the way that he goes about finding her is climbing into a disused well in his garden. He climbs down to the bottom of the well and he kind of sits there. And this well plays into the surrealist quality of this book. There is a labyrinth involved, and his brother-in-law is involved, and his wife is gone, and he's trying to follow clues that don't make any sense. Meanwhile, there is a strange connection between the teenage girl, the girl who keeps calling him, who has a connection to Malta. I cannot remember all the details. There's also an ex-Yakuza bouncer type guy who comes around his house and threatens him. These are all the disparate things that I remember from the book, and I can only vaguely recall the cohesive core, if you like, of this book. It's a really strange one, and I absolutely love it. I adore the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. The teenage girl refers to him as Mr. Wind-Up Bird, and that's where the name comes from. And I can't remember why. There's a lot of things I don't remember, and the more I keep saying that, the less you're going to trust me as a source of Murakami information. Nothing I can do about that. I read a lot of books, and I can't remember all the details of all of his novels, except for the fact that I really love them. I really do. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I like Murakami so much at the end, but I have one more book to recommend you. I'm going to title this For the Reader Who Wants to Jump In at the Deep End. Did I already use that? I can't have. Kafka on the Shore. I've already mentioned a few times that Murakami is a big fan of Franz Kafka, and some of his books take elements of Kafkaesque and weave them into his narrative. His books are not truly Kafkaesque by any stretch. If you're a fan of Kafka, I'm a massive fan of Kafka, you'll recognize that. But there are elements of the Kafkaesque, the idea of people running in place, the idea of people not making progress with their lives and feeling lost and having no solution to their problems and not being provided any solution, as if the world is mechanically designed to be a labyrinth, to be confusing. And that's very Kafkaesque, but it's not rooted in, bureaucracy. It's not rooted in government structures or anything and awkward social networks or whatever, the way that Kafka's writing is. It doesn't really go into that. It basically takes the core ideas of Kafka's writing and imbues them with a sense of mad surrealism, urban fantasy, and just goes hog wild with them. And Kafka on the Shore is a great example of this. Kafka on the Shore tells the story of the protagonist, a young boy who names himself Kafka. He's a 16-year-old boy, he's a pretentious, bookish kid, and he is running away from his home and his life in Tokyo when we meet him. He's about 16, I think, and he's running off from Tokyo and he's going south. I can't remember where he ends up, but he ends up in a foresty place in a prefecture, somewhere probably near Kyoto, Kansai area, I can't remember. And he ends up in this place where he works at a library, and he's working for this woman, and she used to be a musician or something, and he has one of her records. See, I can't remember. And then there's another protagonist who's this strange middle-aged guy who clearly has some issue with his mind, and he's able to talk to cats, and he finds cats, and he talks to them, and he lures them back into his home, and he's working for someone and doing something really shady. I think it's the Yakuza, I can't remember. I keep saying I can't remember. Oh my god, I'm so bad at this. So Kafka on the Shore is a really, really weird one. It's quite a long book. Kafka on the Shore, I should mention, Kafka on the Shore and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle are both pretty lengthy. They're both 500-600 pages long, and I do know that the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is longer in Japanese because there were a few chapters that were actually cut out for the English. Murakami arguably needs an editor. Kafka on the Shore is also a particularly slow book, and it really is where you start to see the Murakami bingo sheet. Like, you've got the cats, you've got disappearing people, you've got weird relationships with women, mothers, wives, you've got strange, surreal things that don't make any sense, you've got holes appearing in the ground. It really is peak Murakami. I arguably think, as I said, Killing Commendatore, if that's how you pronounce it, is peak Murakami, because that book is almost like he was taking the piss a little bit. Because it's like he knows about his tropes, he knows about his bingo sheet, and he knows that he can just do what he wants. So Killing Commendatore, he wrote an 800-page epic where his tropes are basically ticked off one by one. I think it's a great book for that reason. I think it's a lot of fun. It's almost tongue-in-cheek, but still a very, very serious Murakami novel, and I don't think people talk about it enough. It came out a few years ago, and then it just stopped being talked about. I thought it was really good. Anyway, that's not the book I'm recommending. The book I'm recommending is Kafka on the Shore. If you want to jump into the weirdness, the surrealism of Murakami, that's the one. And again, it's one of his more popular ones. Now, I'm not going to talk here about Murakami books that I don't like, and there are quite a few, although I actually did do that a little bit earlier. But there are a few that I really don't care for, and there are also a few that I haven't read. I have never read 1Q84, which is an enormous 3-volume, 1,200-page novel about a giant cult or something. I have not read it. I don't know when I'm going to read it. What I am going to do is briefly talk about why you should read Murakami, what it is about him that I think does separate him from other writers. What's interesting about Japanese literature, and Japanese literature is my favorite. You know, if you were to name literature from different countries in the world, if you were to rank the countries that literature comes from that you like best, for me, country-wise, my list would be Japan, then Korea, and then probably Argentina. Those are the three countries that I think put out the most interesting literature, at least for me. And what I love about Japanese literature specifically is that it often deals very well with space. The Japanese to English translators are such incredible people, and they really manage to capture that feeling of space. Japanese literature has a great relationship with space. The novels sometimes move very, very slowly, but not in a boring way. They dance quietly and somberly. There is an element of quiet, of background noise. They're books where you can often, when you're reading a Japanese novel, you can hear the birds singing and you can feel the air around you and you can see the sky above. It has a sense of space, a sense of dimension around it. When you really get lost in a lot of different works of Japanese literature, you feel like you're floating in this space, like there are bigger gaps between the words on the page. That's how it feels to me. When I read a really good and well-translated Japanese novel, I feel like there's more space on the page. There's more white space. That's the only way I can describe it. And Murakami, this was the first time and probably the best example of this feeling. I get it a lot. I got it when I recently reread Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima. But Murakami manages to do it so well. He really doesn't rush, and his books are really long for that reason, but there is definitely a sense of breathing and taking in the space a little bit that I absolutely adore. Another reason that I like him so much is because of his tropes. You get a sense of the familiar, you know? His books are like a hug. If there are books that you have that you find yourself rereading quite a lot, your comfort food, Murakami very much feels like comfort food. Although he has big ideas and some of his books are very literary and strange and surreal and Kafkaesque and all this other stuff, it's very nice to still be able to enjoy them in a kind of satisfying, commercial, easy to digest way. I really think Murakami's books have a sense of ease and satisfaction about them. They are comfortable, they are comforting, and I really love that. Murakami is also one of the first Japanese authors that I ever read. Hiromi Kawakami, Haruki Murakami, Banana Yoshimoto. I think those were the first three Japanese novelists that I read, and I still have a very large space in my heart for all three of them. And Murakami happens to be Japan's biggest name in literature. So if you haven't read him, if you don't know where to start reading Japanese literature in general, a lot of people will point you towards Murakami, and for good reason. So there you go. Whatever kind of reader you are, hopefully you found something in this list of 5. What I talk about when I talk about running is a wonderful short piece of non-fiction that really eases you into his mind and his world and his philosophy. A Wild Sheep Chase is a great introduction if you want to start at the beginning and you don't want anything too surreal. The same can be said for Norwegian Wood, a very, very grounded, if a little bit dark book with zero strangeness and surrealism in it. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is his biggest and most successful book in terms of his surreal oeuvre. It's a difficult word to say. And then, what haven't I mentioned? Kafka on the Shore. Kafka on the Shore is bonkers, and people love it for that reason. So if you want the bonkers, go for that. It's really up to you where you want to start reading Murakami, but I highly recommend him either way. If I was to give you one solid recommendation for where to start reading Murakami, I would probably say The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle because it's strange but not too strange, or what I talk about when I talk about running, so you can be eased into the writer's mind before actually reading his literature, and it's also, as I've said, really short. So there you go. If you want 2 personal recommendations, what I talk about when I talk about running, and The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which is my favourite Murakami novel. Alright, we're done. If you are a big fan of Murakami, and I haven't mentioned one of your favourites, or one of these was your favourite, tell me why. I want to start a discussion about Murakami. I'm not going to start a Murakami book club anytime soon, but I do want to discuss his works, and I want to know if you love him, why you love him. I don't think I did a great job of explaining why I love Murakami so much, so I want to know why you do. So tell me in the comments. And subscribe for books.